Yesterday, in a move that many had been anticipating, but perhaps not so soon, Nicola Sturgeon resigned from her post as First Minister of Scotland. Now, in a long-winded speech, Sturgeon eventually said she'd stay on until a next leader is elected, but speculation, of course, is growing over who that might be. Unlike in 2014, when Sturgeon stood unopposed as the protégé of Alex Salmond, there's no immediately obvious successor to take on the role. And a power vacuum now exists in Scotland. Who or what might fill it? Well, I'm delighted to be joined this morning to discuss this by Alistair Carmichael, the MP for Orkney and Shetland, former Secretary of State for Scotland during the coalition government as well. Alistair, thank you for joining me. You have the one of the rare honours of being a Scottish MP who has actually retained your seat for more than the last decade. You have been up there in Orkney and Shetland and really see a tumultuous change come in terms of, in 2010, the Labour Party almost sweeping the board in Scotland. In 2015, the SNP winning all but 3 seats. Is that sort of a flash in the pan? Or does the SNP's hold over Scotland stretch beyond one central figure?
Well, that, I think, is what we're about to learn, isn't it? There has been a growing feeling in the last few weeks and months, actually, that it was all beginning to catch up with the SNP and that the baggage of 15 years of government without really a brilliant record of delivery was beginning to be found out. So, you know, we shall see what comes next. The SNP remain in a massively dominant position in Scotland. But then again, as you say, that was where the Labour Party was until 2015. Change sometimes when it comes can come at a quite remarkable rate and in a very dramatic way. I think, though, that, you know, any objective analysis will tell you that with Nicola Sturgeon gone, there is no obvious successor, and that may ultimately be the biggest weakness of her legacy.
It's interesting because other parties across the United Kingdom have had in recent years a bit of a torrid time when they've had leadership elections. We saw the blue on blue over the summer did no favours for the Conservative Party's poll ratings, and similarly, back in 2015, the Labour Party sort of had an internal spasm, really, and produced Jeremy Corbyn as leader. Might we see some yellow-on-yellow Scottish nationalist action, some candidates really chasing after the most extreme parts of their narrow selectorate?
I think that's eminently possible. I can tell you, because I sit behind them in the House of Commons every day when the House is sitting, that there are a lot of divisions, and very deep and occasionally very bitter divisions within that SNP group at Westminster, which I think reflect the divisions within the party themselves. Nicola Sturgeon, by sheer force of personality and a significant amount of political skill, was able to manage these divisions, to hold the whole thing together. But even she has been struggling lately. You know, when you see SNP MPs blocking each other on Twitter, then you know that actually everything is not all happy in that camp.
It seemed like Nicola Sturgeon's grip over the SNP has been weakening in recent weeks, recent months, with the ousting of Ian Blackford down in Westminster. Now, you're saying you sit just behind that SNP grouping. What was your sense in terms of how that sort of coup took place amongst the SNP group? How, indeed, Stephen Flynn took on the role, because he's not an ally of Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, so we're told, and indeed I understand that to be the case. Exactly how these things happen, they still keep fairly tight. I mean, the defining characteristic of the SNP in 2015 was that they had this Stalinist discipline within their group, and, you know, they moved almost in lockstep, literally and politically. That has started to unravel in recent times. As for Ian Blackford, I think there was a combination of, yes, Ian was seen as being a proxy for unhappiness with other things that Nicola Sturgeon was doing with her leadership, especially this quite bizarre idea of using the next election as a de facto referendum on Scottish independence. But also there were elements there that within the group he wasn't seen as being as effective as they wanted. And, I think it was a combination of all these things that came to the boiling point and meant that he left not in as bad a way as he might have done, but certainly it was not exactly one of the more dignified exits I've ever seen in politics.
Now, clearly there were many different factors that led to Nicola Sturgeon's resignation yesterday, but one of the most recent and perhaps the most public was this issue over Gender Recognition Act reform, something that, of course, the United Kingdom government decided to block and something that Nicola Sturgeon seemed to get into a bit of a muddle over when interviewed about. Does it now damage the cause of the Scottish Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Labour Party in that they backed the SNP's legislation over gender reform?
No, look, our MSPs did support it, but the party as a whole, as I recall, actually made it a free vote, and I think that was a sensible and reasonable thing to do. I think the mistake that Nicola Sturgeon made there was then trying to do what they had done with everything else for the last 8 years and turn it from an issue about the rights of transgender people into a constitutional issue. And suddenly we weren't talking about what was the appropriate age for a gender recognition certificate to be granted or any of that sort of stuff. But it was all yet again about independence, and it was trying to widen that gap and grow that sense of grievance. And for the first time, in any significant way, they failed in generating that sense of grievance. And, I think in many ways that kind of caught them blindsided. So, that's something that will be at the top of the in tray for the incoming First Minister, I've no doubt.
So just finally in this conversation, Alistair Carmichael, was the United Kingdom government right? Was Alistair Jack and Rishi Sunak right in their decision to block that reform in an extraordinary and unprecedented move?
No, I mean, personally, I think there are other things that they could have done. There are other mechanisms within the Scotland Act. I think the Section 35 order is, effectively the sledgehammer to crack a nut. And they too politicised this and tried to make it a constitutional issue. So I think both the government in Edinburgh and the government in London have a lot of sharing of the blame to do there. In the time that I was in government, and indeed for the years that you had Labour and Liberal Democrats in a administration in the Scottish Parliament, we always sought to make devolution work by getting the governments to work together, because inevitably there will always be an overlap between the functions of government in London and in Holyrood. As long as you do that, as long as you have the political will to make devolution work, it can do some quite remarkable things for people in Scotland. But if instead you see it as being the opportunity to grow the division, widen the splits, then in fact at the end of the day it's the people and the services that they rely on that lose out.
Well, Alistair Carmichael, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really appreciate your thoughts over this enormous issue.